Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at the power of storytelling in business.
Yeah, sounds fascinating.
We'll be looking at specifically excerpts from Putting Stories to Work, Mastering Business Storytelling by Shawn Callahan.
Okay.
Our listeners are really interested in learning how they can use stories to be more persuasive in business.
Interesting.
So let's dive in and see what we can uncover and how these narratives can really act as like user manuals for life.
Yep.
They can give us practical guidance and insights that stick with us.
Well, one of the things that I found really intriguing about Callahan's book is that he talks about stories being kind of in our DNA. It's not like some modern method of, communication or persuasion.
hmm
We as humans have been using stories for millennia, right, to learn to connect and to survive.
Okay, so then why are they so effective?
Well, he tells this really interesting anecdote in the book about a CSIRO engineer who actually invented a rifle scope that could see around corners. This was during the Iraq War, and he presented this idea to his superiors, and they basically shot it down because they told him that, he was supposed to be working on other things.
Oh, well, a missed opportunity.
Yeah, but the story isn't just about the invention, it's actually a reflection of the organization's culture.
How so?
It's like an unspoken user manual that reveals how things actually work within that environment.
So it's about understanding the deeper meaning behind the story.
Exactly. And Callahan goes on to argue that stories can be more persuasive than just logical arguments because of this thing called confirmation bias,
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
which is basically that tendency for people to resist opinions that challenge their existing beliefs.
Right, we tend to favor information that confirms our worldview.
So how do stories kind of get past that?
Yeah.
Well, instead of telling people what to think, stories allow individuals to draw their own conclusions.
Oh, okay, I like that.
He gives this example of a bank leader who decided to change the name of their branches to stores, and it caused a lot of confusion and resistance from the staff.
Huh. It seems like maybe a clarity story could have helped there.
Exactly. They could have used the story to explain the why behind the change.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So how can we get better at spotting and remembering these really powerful stories?
Well, the book talks about developing a search image.
What's that?
Basically, you train your mind to identify those little narrative gems that are hidden in everyday events. And Callahan suggests that we can tag stories mentally so we can recall them more easily later.
Okay.
So, for example, you could tag a story about someone overcoming adversity with resilience or problem solving. So, when you need to illustrate those concepts later, that story will come to mind.
Well, that's smart. I like that.
Yeah.
Now, what about story triggering, prompting others to share their narratives?
Well, the book gives this great example of a mining company that used cartoons with blank speech bubbles.
Interesting.
And the miners were so curious about what the cartoon was about that they started telling their own stories to fill in the blanks.
Oh, wow. I love that. So it's like a subtle invitation to share.
Exactly. And then there's story listening, which is a little bit more than just attentive hearing.
Okay.
It's about creating the right conditions for people to feel comfortable sharing their stories.
Mm.
So asking open-ended questions, showing genuine curiosity and being empathetic.
I see. So it's about building that trust and rapport.
Right. Callahan also talks about the power of personal anecdotes and how being vulnerable and sharing personal turning points can build trust with your audience.
Okay, so by revealing those moments of growth or challenge in your own life, you're basically showing that you're human and relatable.
However, there is a cautionary tale in the book where Callahan talks about how his own connection story backfired because he'd had a falling out with the person in the story.
Oh, so like even the expert can make mistakes.
It just goes to show that you have to be mindful of the emotional undertones in your stories and make sure they align with your intended message.
So it's about being authentic, but also strategic.
And speaking of strategy, Callahan offers some great tips on tailoring your stories to different situations and audiences.
Give me an example.
He says to avoid explicitly labeling everything as a story. Instead, just seamlessly weave it into the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And you can use time markers like a few weeks ago or back when I was.
Oh, I like that. That's a smooth way to transition.
He also recommends testing your stories with trusted colleagues to get feedback and make sure they're landing the way you intend.
Like a dress rehearsal before the big show.
Exactly.
Okay, so testing is important, but are there certain types of stories that work better in specific situations?
Well, Callahan actually identifies several different patterns, each with its own purpose. Like, for instance, there's something called connection stories, which are great for introductions or building rapport.
Okay.
Instead of just rattling off your credentials, you can use a story to subtly reveal aspects of your character and expertise.
Interesting.
He gives an example of a British HR director who was tasked with persuading Indian employees to resign and sign a new agreement after their company was acquired.
Oh, wow. That's a tough situation.
Yeah, and on his way to the meeting, he stopped to help a young boy who was struggling with his groceries. And the boy's family was so grateful for his help.
Hmm.
And later, when he met with the employees, he shared this anecdote, and it really helped to demonstrate his trustworthiness and genuine concern.
So that simple act of kindness became a powerful tool for connection.
Exactly. Now, another type of story is called clarity stories, which are really useful for communicating changes and decisions.
Okay.
Because if people don't have a clear narrative, they often invent their own, which can lead to all sorts of problems.
Like in the example with the bank leader renaming branches to stores.
Right. A well-structured clarity story could have explained the context, the problem, the decision, and the intended outcome.
And maybe even involve perspectives from multiple stakeholders.
Exactly. Now, what if you need to change someone's viewpoint?
Ah, persuasion.
That's where influence stories come in. Remember confirmation bias?
Oh, yeah.
If you try to argue with someone directly, it often triggers defensiveness, but stories can kind of sneak past those mental barriers. The book talks about Edward Dicey's experiment at the University of Rochester, where he had participants solve puzzles.
Mm-hmm.
Some were paid for their time and some weren't.
Interesting.
And what they found was that the people who were paid stopped working as soon as the experimenter left the room, but those who weren't paid continued working.
Really?
So it kind of highlights the limitations of external rewards.
And the power of intrinsic motivation.
Exactly. A leader could use this story to advocate for approaches that tap into people's inherent drive rather than just relying on extrinsic incentives.
Okay. So how do you actually construct a good influence story?
Callahan suggests that you start with a relevant statement, share the anecdote, and then connect it back to your point.
Okay.
And of course, this story needs to be truthful, plausible, and come from a credible source.
Makes sense. So we've got connection stories, clarity stories, and influence stories. What else?
Well, there are also success stories, which are great for showcasing positive outcomes and inspiring others to follow suit. Companies often spend a fortune on case studies that just end up gathering dust. But if they turn those case studies into engaging success stories, they'd have a much bigger impact.
Okay. How do you structure a success story?
Callahan recommends outlining the challenge, explaining the approach, describing the positive results, and then highlighting the emotions involved.
Okay. So basically, what was the problem? How did you solve it? What happened? And how did it make everyone feel?
Pretty much. And then you've got foundation stories, which reveal the origins and core values of an organization.
Uh-huh.
They often revolve around defining moments that shaped the culture and direction of the company.
Like when Steve Jobs returned to Apple and streamlined their product line.
Yeah, he focused on 4 key quadrants, and that strategic shift became part of their company lore.
It's amazing how a single decision can completely reshape a company's trajectory.
It really is.
Yeah.
Now, another type of story is called an analogy story, which is useful for explaining complex concepts by drawing parallels between familiar situations and abstract ideas. The book gives the example of a basketball coach who used the analogy of traversing a balance beam over a treacherous canyon
Wow.
to prepare his team for the pressure of the championship game.
That's a powerful image.
It really conveys the importance of focus and resilience.
I like that. And lastly, we have parables, fables, and fairy tales.
Even though they're fictional, they can impart timeless wisdom and moral lessons.
Like Aesop's fables?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Those stories have endured for centuries because they tap into universal truths about human nature.
Okay. So we've now got 7 different story patterns to choose from.
The key is to select the right pattern for the situation. It's like choosing the right tool from your storytelling toolbox.
Makes sense. So it's not just about knowing the stories, but also knowing when and how to use them.
Exactly. You want to make sure your stories are relatable, emotionally resonant, and offer practical insights.
We've covered a lot of ground here. But how do we actually deliver these stories in a way that's captivating and authentic? It seems like we've uncovered so much already, all these different story patterns and how to use them. But what about the delivery? How can we make sure our stories are actually captivating and authentic?
Well, Callahan has some really practical advice on that, and he really stresses the importance of authenticity and connection.
Okay.
He says to think of it more as a conversation rather than a performance.
Uh-huh.
You want to be present, engage with your audience, and just let the narrative flow naturally.
Right. It should feel genuine, not like some kind of theatrical act.
Exactly. He actually warns against being overly dramatic because it can shift the focus away from the message.
Yeah, I can see that happening.
Like if a leader is trying to tell an anecdote, but they're putting on this big performance, it can come across as insincere.
Right. So how do you strike that balance between engaging your audience and still keeping the message at the forefront?
Well, one tip he gives is to avoid explicitly labeling everything as a story. Instead of saying, I'm going to tell you a story, just weave it into the conversation naturally. Use those time markers like a few weeks ago or back when I was.
Right.
He also encourages people to be vulnerable and share personal turning points.
Okay.
Those moments that reveal your humanity and allow you to connect with the audience on a deeper level.
But I imagine there's a fine line between being vulnerable and overshare.
Oh, absolutely. Especially in a professional setting, you want to find that sweet spot where you're revealing enough to build trust, but not crossing any boundaries.
Right. It's all about being appropriate.
And that's why it's so important to test your stories with trusted colleagues.
Yeah.
Get their feedback, make sure the message is landing the way you intend it to.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into storytelling, what are some of the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest one is that stories are incredibly powerful tools for persuasion, communication, and connection.
Uh-huh.
They tap into our human instincts, bypass those logical barriers, and engage us on an emotional level.
Right.
And if you can master the art of finding, remembering, and sharing those stories authentically, it can make you a more effective leader, communicator, and influencer.
Sounds like storytelling is an ongoing process.
Definitely, it's a journey, not a destination.
I love that.
So keep practicing, keep experimenting, and keep refining your craft.
Great advice.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for joining us on this fascinating exploration of storytelling.
It's been a pleasure.
And for our listeners, here's a quick recap of 10 key takeaways from putting stories to work. Number 1, stories are user manuals for life. They offer us guidance. And insight number 2, stories are more persuasive than logic because they circumvent confirmation bias. Number 3, develop a search image so you can spot stories in everyday life. Number 4, tag your stories mentally for easy recall later. Number 5, story triggering is a great way to encourage others to share their narratives. Number 6, story listening involves creating a safe space for sharing. Number 7, personal anecdotes and turning points help to build trust and rapport. Number 8, tailor your stories to different situations and audiences. Number 9, test your stories with trusted colleagues and get feedback. And number 10, storytelling is a journey, not a destination. So keep refining your craft. And with that, we'll leave you to ponder this question. What personal story can you share to make your next business interaction more persuasive and memorable? Until next time, keep those stories flowing.